We decided to go to the third mountain late in the evening, if not at night, leaving Alyosha, as usual, with his grandmother. Of course, it's much easier to deal with any problem in daylight, but on the other hand, there are a lot more people on the site during the day, therefore, there may be more problems. Are they needed? During the meeting in the park, Ivan said that as soon as the excavations began to come to an end and parts of the ship became visible, every morning, including weekends, 10 nerds began to be brought to the site by minibus, who left in the dark. Ivan, of course, did not know where they lived. They were given some kind of 3-axle super truck with a KM-131 van body, not with 12 windows as usual, but with only 4, which stood slightly away from the tents with personnel. Vanya Medvedev understood the types of vehicles, including military ones. Of course, he didn't know what was inside the fancy Kung, but he thought that all the necessary equipment was stored there, and they seemed to be conducting preliminary research there. It was from there that they ran around the ship in the mornings with various devices in their hands, and all but licked the walls of the space dreadnought. They measured, illuminated, irradiated, photographed, tried to take samples of the hull material. In short, they tried not out of fear, but out of conscience. Although, maybe the other way around. At night, only one guard remained at the facility. Of course, there were more posts at the site after the excavation was completed, and more recently, when the stripping work was almost over, a post appeared at the very door. Hatch of the ship, but still there were an order of magnitude fewer people than during the day. By the way, the same single post stood next to the Kung of scientists, protecting either valuable equipment or the results of research by nerds. They didn't take them with them every time. It was already dusk when he worked the last shift at the site, but when the scientist's minibus was still parked next to the Kung lab, Vanya noticed the light inside the ship coming through the portholes. When the minibus with the researchers disappeared, the lights inside the ship went out. It seems that the nerds did not eat their bread in vain. They managed to get on board almost immediately and have already figured out the lighting system. Lena reacted philosophically to this message. Well, the better, we'll have to worry less. For a long time they wondered, even argued, how to get to the third mountain and even get right to the ship. It is clear that Max will have to put a lot of people to sleep for this. Ivan preferred to say turn it off. Lena used a more inert word, neutralize. The question was, did Maxim have the strength? While working at the site, despite Elena's pleas for caution, Medvedev nevertheless tried to track and count the number of guards, and, in his opinion, he succeeded. There could be from 30 to 40 people here at a time, including the guards, the duty shift in the guardhouse, and vacationers. Will Max be able to influence such a huge mass of people? What if his strength runs out after the second or third attempt? Unfortunately, it was possible to verify this only during the penetration, as they called the experiment really dangerous, and at the same time unpredictable in its consequences and results. Ivan proposed to reduce the number of guards by using a diversionary maneuver. For example, you can set a small fire somewhere in the Umshanik area or on Belazovskaya Road, which is still close to the checkpoint, and throw a dozen blanks, of which, as it turned out, he had 2 or even 3 handfuls in his garage. Naturally, the head of the guard will respond appropriately to shots fired near the protected facility, and some of the soldiers will be sent to investigate the situation. So there will be fewer of them. But Elena, with her investigative experience, immediately dismissed his proposal as having no prospects for fulfilling their main task, calmly entering the facility. First, the boss may send not an entire shift, but a couple of soldiers to collect information, who will not find anything unusual, which is likely to alert the soldier. Where are the shots coming from if there is no one around? Something's not right here. Secondly, close shooting, even without signs of an attack on the object, will lead to an alarm the guards can strengthen, which will greatly complicate the task of safely reaching the ship. Thirdly, even if half of the personnel go to the showdown, then returning and finding the sleeping guards, who will still need to be turned off, this anxiety will increase and it will certainly be uncomfortable. Fourthly, these very smart feds, having quickly calculated that the facility is not in danger, can easily dump the problem to the municipalities. Your land, you figure it out. She could have said more and more, but that was enough for Ivan. He admitted that Elena was right. In the end, there was only one option left, to neutralize all the awake soldiers very quietly, gradually, and then all the others in order to avoid undesirable consequences that, according to the law of meanness, would necessarily arise at the most inopportune moment. What to do if suddenly one of the guards does not want to sleep, but wants to ask uncomfortable questions for the saboteurs, arguing with the barrel of a machine gun? Somehow they did not think. The base camp, at Ivan's suggestion, was set up on an Umshanik, depicting a company of fishermen who gathered to spend the night on the lake. We pumped up the boat, swam along the reeds, sat with fishing rods, and in the late afternoon we set up a tent and lit a campfire. It seems like it turned out. When the fire had burned out, and only a thin light gray coating of ashes remained from the coals, scattering even from the slightest breeze, it was decided to go to the unknown. They were still trying to joke. The little traveled, grassy road from the lake was illuminated only by dimly twinkling stars, periodically hiding behind oncoming clouds, but it was possible to walk along it even without a lantern. Ivan assured me that there would be minor problems only here, by the lake, and on the way to the checkpoint, and then everything would be like on the central square in the city before the holiday. When the ship was being excavated, the soldiers, in order not to slow down the overburden, installed so many lanterns on the site that they probably hadn't turned on the entire section since its discovery. Hiding in the shadow of the roadside bushes, and then after turning the road in the darkness of the dump walls, so that it was almost impossible to see their silhouettes, trying to move as quietly as possible, they gradually approached the checkpoint. It was not easy to get to the already lighted barrier, where the first sentry should be waiting for the uninvited guests. The illuminated, open space was already easily visible here, and only along one of the walls of the dump there was a short but dense shadow. The switch Mac, who was walking in front, did not have time to take even a couple of steps because of the turn towards the dump, hiding behind which he hoped to get to the checkpoint, as Lena stopped and made a slight click with her tongue. The uninitiated would hardly have been able to understand this sound in the darkness of the night, but Maxim and Ivan understood it perfectly correctly. And they froze. Even before the hike, the guys agreed to attract attention in this way in case of danger or any other emergency situation. You can't use your hands in the dark, as it was during the war with the jeep chasing them, and it's difficult to see these physical exercises at night. Whistling, which can be heard far away at night, is easy to attract the attention of the guards. They could not scream like nightbirds, but a light click of the tongue is heard only by those who are standing nearby. And it's not easy to recognize it, to understand what kind of sound it is and that it is made by a person. Lena approached her husband very carefully and whispered softly in his ear with her lips alone. "Max, there are two men here. A little above us and about 30 meters ahead, on a ledge somewhere among the rocks. It looks like some kind of hidden post that is set up at night. I don't feel aggressive. Most likely, we haven't been seen or heard yet. Can you neutralize them?" Maxim was taken aback. Wow, a surprise. If it hadn't been for Elena Kurdik, he would have come to them in just a couple of minutes. You can't get away with saying that you got lost or ran to look at Balaz. I can't see them. How to try? And how to understand what happened? I can't see anything. But I can hear it. You try, right ahead and a little higher. She once again pointed to the supposed ambush site. Maxim tried. Nothing happened for a few seconds, then there was a dull, heavy thud, as if someone had fallen, followed by the soft thud of a metal object falling on the rocks. Holy shit! Max imagined a soldier falling from his height onto a stone ledge. That's how you can crash. Again, he hadn't thought. And the metallic thud is most likely because the machine gun fell out. Although, on the other hand, why is he standing in ambush? It is necessary to lie down, hide, Maxim argued amateurishly. It's okay, Max, I can't feel them, they're probably asleep already, Elena declared in the same whisper, but a little louder. At that moment, Ivan joined them, and they had to be brought up to date on how Lena felt the soldiers, and how Maxim turned them off. Medvedev also began to scold himself in a whisper. First of all, he should have thought about it, it was elementary and he had come across it more than once. And how many times during the war did you keep such secrets yourself? In the end, he went to check on the sleeping secrets. He was gone for a long time. From the ledge where Ivan went, there was a rustle, muffled sounds, as if something heavy was being turned, a rustle, a couple of times a soft metallic clang. Maxim was just about to go to Ivan's aid when he appeared in front of them almost noiselessly, hiding behind the shadow of the dump wall. It was difficult to recognize him. In one hand he carried a large bundle of clothes, in the other two hemispherical special forces helmets, and on his shoulder he carried two machine guns. Lena reacted appropriately. She immediately understood Medvedev's plan, but Max was taken aback. I don't understand, he said almost in a full voice, then, catching himself, put his hand over his mouth. Max even began to explain the obvious things to a child, trying to keep his voice down. We can't risk Elena Yurievna. In order for us not to get into the next such secret, she must go ahead. And if she doesn't see outsiders, in the sense of soldiers, he won't make it. Will they see her? We don't know the range of her abilities, maybe it's only 50 meters. You remember how you couldn't influence the soldiers from the dump yourself, and there would be less than a kilometer there. And it can be seen from a kilometer away. There's light everywhere. Of course, they won't shoot right away, But they can easily raise the alarm. Do we need it? Shortly you and I change into the camouflage of these Jedi. He nodded his head in the direction of the FSB officers sleeping on the ledge, and calmly go to the checkpoint. They'll see us, of course, but I think they'll take us for their own. Explaining, Medvedev began to slowly but confidently pull on the uniform of an undressed, sleeping Special Forces soldier, handing the second set to Maxim. While they're thinking about why the shift is returning before the deadline, we'll have time to get closer to them, well, then your exit. Comrade Mauser, or would you prefer a Jedi? He managed to joke, and gently patted the frozen Maxim on the shoulder. Despite the strangeness of the situation, he accepted the joke and laughed. And what's wrong with his Jedi skills? They could even ruin the opponent's weapons from a distance. And he incapacitates the opponents themselves from afar. Maybe he's even cooler? Lena was thinking about something else entirely. Ivan Alexeyevich, they won't freeze there. She nodded her head towards the ledge, referring to the naked soldiers. The stones are still there, and the night is cool. Come on, Elena Yurievna, this is the Special Forces. We, ordinary soldiers, have been in such situations in Chechnya more than once. Everything will be fine. She spread her arms, then suddenly clasped her hands and pointed at the boy's shoes. And the shoes, Ivan Alexeyevich? Shoes. She remembered that the guard at the checkpoint was wearing boots like a Faraday brand. Yes, the sneakers worn by the newly minted commandos were somehow not mounted with military overalls, but Medvedev looked at Elena with a slight reproach. Elena Yurievna. His intonation reminded me of the voice of Mikhail Ivanovich, from the Diamond Hand during a conversation with Semyon Semyonich Gorbunkov in a taxi, when he hid the money given to him under his cap and the gun in his string bag. Those kids were also wearing sneakers. The experts, you can't say anything. You can't run over the stones in Kirzaks if you need to. Lena fell silent in embarrassment, realizing that it was better not to discuss these issues with Vanya. Vanya Medvedev's idea turned out to be successful. It worked 100%. The new Jedi disguised in camouflage, one of whom had a slightly oversized uniform, calmly waddled up to the barrier, where a young guard was bored alone, who turned to them at the last moment. Or rather, he tried. He couldn't find out what he wanted to find out. The soldier suddenly stopped talking, looked up at them in surprise, jerked his head and sagged heavily, managing not to hit his head. The noise of the fallen body was not very loud, even the machine gun hanging on his chest managed to fall without significant noise. The fallen asleep sentry moved unhurriedly to the nearest shade, and a new guard appeared at the post near the barrier, no different from the previous one, except perhaps for non-standard shoes and the lack of any zeal for surveying the surroundings. He began to stroll melancholically along the barrier, sometimes turning to a trailer standing a little further back. The crunch of his footsteps could be heard clearly and drowned out the footsteps of the second, who immediately went straight to the resting place of the shift on duty. The trailer, from where the first one appeared during Maxim and Lena's first visit to the third mountain, which cut off all Elena's attempts to get to the site, turned out to be another weak link in the chain of unusual shutdowns. Maxim entered the closed door without knocking, and, as Mayakovsky would say, calm from the outside. A minute later, he appeared and made it clear to Ivan with a raised hand gesture that everything was in order. From his point of view. An hour later, the notorious first, and second Derwo and third Derwo and all the others, as the cat Matryoshkin would reproachfully say, the guards at the site, were sleeping peacefully. The sentry at Kung's was sleeping, the sentry at the ship's hatch was sleeping, the paired mobile posts circling the perimeter of the ship became completely motionless, but the camouflaged guards were lying quite far from each other. Max decided not to check the range of his abilities at the wrong time. I checked it out. It was definitely enough for 100 meters. There was neither the time nor the desire to experiment with soldiers sleeping in large tents without their outfits. The shamelessly advancing dawn hurried the boys and pushed them to rash actions, and this was their first mistake. At the end of the massive shutdown, Elena appeared at the site, who looked around carefully, listened to her feelings and with some inner displeasure, said, "Everything seems to be calm. I don't feel any aggression. And there don't seem to be anyone awake either." Then she turned towards the ship, listened to herself again, and said with a completely different intonation, "Let's go to the ship, guys," and added something completely unexpected, "They're waiting for us there." Elena, Maxim, and even imagined the spaceship a little differently. Their performances were based mainly on Star Wars, Alien, and the cartoons The Mystery of the Third Planet, and Dunno on the Moon. Maxim, a fan of science fiction, could tell a little more about starships. His knowledge was based not only on films, but also on books by Selyagin, Muravyov, Orlov, to which he was a great hunter. For the most part, they were talking about powerful multi-kilometer space monsters capable of withstanding nuclear, plasma, and any other weapons that had not yet been invented, capable of destroying a huge enemy fleet or an entire planet in an instant. Now in front of them was a ship shaped more like an airship with a small tail, small wings located along the entire body from below, and a clear line of round portholes on board. The dimensions of this airship were impressive. True, they weren't as long as Max had expected, but they were quite impressive by Earth standards. It's about 200 or 300 meters long and the height of a 5-story house. It was difficult to estimate its width, since some part of it hung over the slope of the collapsed side of the quarry and was hidden in the night darkness, and there were no lanterns on the other side. But it wasn't just the size that was surprising. Despite the fact that the interstellar dreadnought had been lying in the ground for many years and carried a load of several 100,000 tons on its shoulders, it looked like new. Its body was steel gray in color, but without its inherent cold hue, but on the contrary, some kind of warm. It was not covered with rust, there were no cracks, dents, scratches, there was not even the slightest dull coating characteristic of the oxidation of terrestrial metals. This alone made one think about the unearthly origin of the ship. Above the wing, which stretched almost from the nose of the hull to the tail, there were several hatch doors, forming an almost integral whole with the hull. The edges of this 3-meter entrance could be guessed by changing the color of the ship's skin in this place in the form of a narrow ellipse to a darker one. On the ground near the wing, near such an ellipse located in the bow of the hull, there was an ordinary Chinese metal ladder with wide steps and a small railing, next to which an unfortunate sentry was resting. Elena went up the stairs first. Maxim and Vanya lingered a little, dragging the sleeping guard a little to the side. It was somehow inconvenient to pass by the person lying next to him. Lena stood in front of the monolithic wall, but she was completely calm. She knew that she would definitely get on board the ship, then she raised her palm to the silver barrier and immediately felt a slight warmth. After a few seconds, the part of the side outlined by the dark contour began to lose its structure, became covered with a haze resembling streams of warm air, and then completely disappeared. It was so unexpected that in any other situation, Elena would have thought many times before deciding on this dubious adventure, to step into a place where it is completely unknown what awaits, practically into the unknown, but here she did not doubt for a second. It had taken her too long to get there. As soon as her silhouette disappeared into the belly of a huge foreign house, the dark opening of the wall was again covered with waves of gray haze, and in a second nothing reminded of the passage that had just been there. When Maxime and Ivan climbed onto the wing, there was once again an indestructible monolith of silver-gray color in front of them, and all their attempts to change the situation led to nothing. All that remained was to wait. Maxime's despair knew no bounds. For several minutes, he darted around the wing from one outlined oval to another, unsuccessfully pounding on the wall with his hands and feet, even trying to scream. Then, as if realizing it, he raised the machine gun and pointed it towards the nearest porthole, but Ivan raised a warning finger to his lips, then pointed at tents with sleeping soldiers standing 50 meters from the ship. "Max, calm down," he said quietly but weightily. "Nothing's going to happen to her. You remember how she said, 'They're waiting for us there.' They were probably just waiting for her. Otherwise, we would have been launched too. Now we'll be waiting for her here." And he looked carefully around, trying to figure out if they had woken up any of those who had fallen asleep without Maxime's help. He sat down weakly on the wing, leaned his back against the wall of the ship and looked at Ivan with the face of a beaten dog, as if he wanted to say, "It's good for you." But remained silent. Tell someone who has been aboard an alien spaceship during his lifetime, at best they will not believe him, at worst they will laugh. They'll pick up words so offensive that you won't want to tell them yourself. Elena wasn't thinking about it now. She stood in total darkness and was completely calm. Why worry? Surely the nerds who had already been on board had made all the necessary measurements. Alpha and beta radiation were checked, gamma quanta were looked at, and neutron radiation was measured. Yes, and all the crops and microflora have been completed, and the composition of the air has been looked at here. I wonder if they were wearing protective suits or not. Ivan didn't say anything about it. I only mentioned that when the nerds were here, the lights were on in the portholes. How did they manage to turn it on? And as soon as Lena thought about it, the thick darkness gradually began to recede, and she realized that she was in a small room, which a knowledgeable person would call an airlock. 2 ellipsoid-shaped doors led out of it, the contours of which were becoming more and more clearly visible, although Lena did not touch them. "We are glad to see you aboard the Princess Ilshanora, Elena Yurievna." A calm and at the same time familiar voice sounded, it seemed, right in Lena's head. Elena was not afraid. She was stunned. How did they know her name? And that voice in your head? A voice from my youth. Her confusion was probably reflected on her face and in her thoughts, which was not lost on the unknown interlocutor. Don't be surprised. You have mental abilities, you have a mind connection, that's why I decided to address you this way. If it is still inconvenient for you, it is possible to continue communication in your usual form in the form of a conversation. What kind of thought connection? How do I own it? Lena was surprised, but managed to pull herself together. If possible, I would like to continue communication in the usual way. Mind communication, which she had no idea about, is not entirely convenient for me yet. I need to get used to it. Okay? The interlocutor accepted her offer, whose voice was no longer in his head, but in the room, but it was difficult to determine from where. It seemed to come from all sides at once. Go to the crew's psychological relief room, he finished. Elena didn't even have time to think about how she would find this room, as yellow squares began to blink on the floor near the left door, and this blinking soon turned into a wave of light that rushed somewhere deep into the ship. There was no doubt that it was necessary to go there, guided by this unusual clue. In the psychological relaxation room, Lena had the feeling that she had already been here. Well, maybe not in this particular room, but something surprisingly familiar was present here. An entire corner of the impressive hall was occupied by tropical plants with an abundance of vines hanging from somewhere above. Green, gray, brown, intertwined with each other, they alternated with shoots rushing upward with leaves and flowers of different shapes and sizes, among which red and orange predominated, and even purple ones came across among the leaves. In the tiny glades, in this abundance of colors, there were unusual bright green balls resembling curled hedgehogs bristling in all directions with long white needles. These flowers, leaves, vines and needles of the hedgehogs swayed slightly, changing their shades, making a light soothing rustle. From this amazing forest, illuminated from the depths, there was a soft hubbub, creaking, and screams of unknown and invisible creatures, and butterflies of various sizes and colors fluttered from one to the other, most of which were bright and eye-catching. In another corner of the hall, where the rainforest crept along the wall, which was impossible to see behind it, there was a real waterfall, with the characteristic sound of falling water and a feeling of freshness from a small lake spreading below. Its shore was overgrown with low, but brightly saturated green grass. Between two rocks with flat, sloping peaks, over which blurred white clouds floated, a stream of water broke through and fell down, narrow at the top and significantly widening at the bottom, hiding here in an abundance of small sparkling spray, similar to fog. The spreading water was lost in the gloom of the room's floor, and it seemed that the running white clouds reflected in it floated away under the dark tiles resembling parquet, and illuminated them from the inside. Lena understood that it was nothing more than a hologram, but it was so beautiful and authentic, and most importantly, familiar. In the next corner of the room there were several rather impressive chairs, leather in appearance, and attractive in their softness. On the opposite wall of the room was a huge half-thin screen made of dark frosted glass. Near one of the chairs there was a three-dimensional translucent silhouette of a man with predominant shades of light green. It's also a hologram, which Elena has repeatedly seen in science fiction films. The man made an inviting gesture with his hand, pointing to one of the chairs. Come in, Elena Yurievna. Have a seat. His voice sounded completely normal and was perceived by Lena calmly. The crazy, overwhelming and at the same time joyful, vivid impressions that had arisen subsided. She pulled herself together. At first glance, the chair seemed a little too big, and Lena was afraid that it would be uncomfortable for her to sit. She wouldn't even rest against the back, but, nevertheless, she sat down on the edge. To her surprise, there were pleasant changes with the chair. It decreased in size, almost adjusted to Elena's figure, and she felt very comfortable. The backrest was moderately soft, but it did not allow you to sink into the depths. The head settled comfortably on its edge, and the hands rested easily on the soft cushions without any tension. Does nothing surprise you here, Elena Yurievna? The hologram man asked the first question. She was ready to scream. That's it, everything is amazing. And this ship is foreign, and this voice, familiar and at the same time alien, and this chair and, in general, everything. She seemed to have calmed down, but now she's back. I didn't panic, no. Confused, I guess? On the one hand, this cannot be, on the other, it already exists. A leapfrog of thoughts about everything that had happened was spinning in Elena's head with incredible speed, but she couldn't give a decent answer. The interlocutor waited a minute, then tried to bring Lena to her senses. Elena Yurievna, we thought that a familiar environment for you would facilitate quick adaptation and productive dialogue. Everything you see here should be familiar to you, because it is taken from your memory. Don't be surprised. You are not ready for contact with other civilizations yet, and it is too early for you to see our true appearance. That's why you see a hologram of an ordinary person, by the way, someone you know well. You are also familiar with these tropical thickets and this waterfall. Lena roused herself, looked around, as she would say at her job in the light of newly discovered circumstances, and mentally slapped her forehead with her palm. Well, wow. Why hadn't she guessed right away? This waterfall is the Altai Caves, where they recently visited with Max and Alyosha, although there are not many stones below, and these tropical thickets, these vines are the Sochi Arboretum, where they were last year. Then this man, Lena thought for a second. If it was just an ordinary person, an earthling, she would certainly recognize him right away, but here is a hologram. Peering once more at the greenish translucent man crouched in front of her, she imagined his voice. My God, this is my favorite criminology teacher, Professor Kardashov Pavel Ivanovich. How could she not recognize him right away? Obviously, the interlocutor read her thoughts and was pleased with the response. He smiled his greenish smile. You have good mental abilities, but you don't know how to protect your thoughts at all. We teach this to children from birth. And a person who is unable to protect his mental field can easily be subordinated to someone else's will. Lena was taken aback. Wow. So the aliens can easily bend her to their will and force her to do whatever they want? Elena Yurievna, calm down. No one is going to bend you to someone else's will. It's against the nature of our race. A reasonable being, unless it is an obvious enemy threatening you personally or your loved ones, or grossly violating the laws of the community where he lives, is the highest being in the universe, and he cannot be subjected to any violence, including mental violence. That's when Lena panicked again. They were clearly reading her mind, although she hadn't believed it until the last moment, and she was confused. She didn't know what to say in response or what to do so that her thoughts wouldn't be read, but she definitely didn't want to be an open book to strangers. Are there any people at all? Pavel Ivanovich smiled in a fatherly way, except that he didn't pat her on the head. Elena Yurievna, take this object on the table and hold it in your hand. It will block all your thoughts from being read by other intelligent ones. And I hope you will feel more confident, and our conversation will be more constructive. On the table in front of the chairs, which resembled an ordinary coffee table, next to a beautiful, completely earthy vase with a bouquet of her favorite daisies, lay a small cube, glittering with silver facets, on which frosted waves ran. It was unexpectedly heavy, but Lena gripped it tightly in her hand. Who are you? She asked her first question.